Darkness, a shadow moves through the night streets of Kampala. The year is 1971. Soldiers whisper, radios crackle, the city holds its breath. A coup is unfolding, but behind the chaos, behind the silence before the gunfire, lies a man whose name will soon strike both fear and fascination across the world. Idi Amin Dada, to his enemies, the butcher of Africa. To his loyalists, a hero who stood tall against the empire. To history, an enigma. His story is not just about a dictator. It is about how power corrupts, how fear can be weaponized, and how Africa's destiny has always been stalked by shadows, some within, some from faraway lands that never wanted the continent free. To understand Amin, you must enter a world of contradictions. A man accused of killing thousands, yet loved by ordinary people who saw him as a son of the soil. A man mocked by the West as a clown, yet feared because he dared to speak truths they could not silence. A man whose very existence blurs the line between myth and reality, between propaganda and fact.
And I will never give up. If I wanted to do something, I will never change my mind.
Idi Amin was born sometime around 1925, though the exact year remains uncertain, as if history itself wished to keep him cloaked in mystery. He came from the Kakwa people in northwestern Uganda, a minority tribe often overlooked by the ruling elites of the south. His childhood was one of poverty, simplicity, and survival. His father abandoned the family, and his mother raised him alone. She was a herbalist, a healer, and some say Amin inherited from her both his imposing strength and a deep sense of destiny. As a boy, Amin was tall, restless, and unusually strong. He grew up barefoot, fishing in the Nile, herding goats under the burning sun, and fighting with other boys in the dusty streets. He had little education, some say he never advanced beyond 4th grade. But what he lacked in books, he made up for in physical presence. His size alone marked him out. By the time he was a teenager, he stood well over 6 feet tall, a giant among his peers. But what would he do with that strength? Opportunity came not from Uganda itself, but from empire. The British colonial rulers, always eager to recruit tall, disciplined Africans for their army, noticed Amin. In 1946, he enlisted in the King's African Rifles, a regiment of the British colonial army. This was the crucible that would shape him. In the barracks, Amin found a new family. He learned how to handle weapons, how to march, how to fight. He served in Somalia, suppressing Somali rebels who resisted colonial rule. Later he was sent to Kenya, where the British waged a brutal war against the Mau Mau freedom fighters. Amin fought for the empire against Africans who wanted freedom. A cruel irony, but also a lesson in how colonialism twisted destinies. The young soldier saw firsthand the machinery of repression, torture, executions, the way the British crushed resistance without mercy. These years planted in him both loyalty to the army and a cold familiarity with violence as a tool of power. But Amin was no ordinary soldier. He was fearless in combat, physically unstoppable and ambitious. His superiors admired his toughness, but also worried about his temper. They called him simple-minded, unpredictable, dangerous. Yet they promoted him. By the late 1950s, he had risen to sergeant, then lieutenant. In the colonial army, very few Africans were allowed to climb the ranks, but Amin, with his size and loyalty, was too valuable to ignore. He gained a reputation for brutality. Stories spread of how he dealt with deserters, how he interrogated prisoners, how he could break a man with his bare hands. But alongside the violence, there was charm. Amin was a performer. He loved sports, especially boxing, and became the heavyweight champion of Uganda. He could make people laugh, imitate accents, dance, and even play music. He had a strange magnetism, a mix of fear and fascination that would follow him all his life. When Uganda gained independence in 1962, Amin was already one of the most powerful African officers in the army. The British had trained him well, and they left him as a key figure in the new nation. But Amin was no mere soldier now. He was watching the shifting sands of politics. Uganda's first Prime Minister, Milton Obote, saw in Amin a useful ally. Obote promoted him, trusted him, and made him a partner in his political struggles. Together they schemed, enriched themselves through smuggling, and built a dangerous bond of convenience. But bonds built on ambition rarely last. Obote saw Amin as a weapon he could use. Amin saw Obote as a stepping stone. And in the shadows, foreign powers were watching both men. The British, the Americans, even the Israelis, each had interests in Uganda, and each knew that in Idi Amin they had a man both dangerous and useful. By the late 1960s, Amin was deputy commander of the entire Ugandan army. He was close to seizing the top. He had money, weapons, and loyalty from many soldiers, especially from his own region. But enemies were gathering, and whispers filled the air. Could this giant of a man, half feared, half admired, one day take it all? By 1970, Uganda was simmering. Prime Minister Milton Obote, once hailed as the father of independence, had grown increasingly authoritarian and paranoid. His alliance with Idi Amin, his towering military chief, was crumbling. The two men had built their partnership on shared ambition, but ambition has a way of turning friends into rivals. Obote accused Amin of corruption, of smuggling ivory and gold from Congo, of enriching himself at the expense of the nation. Amin, in turn, suspected that Obote was plotting to sideline him, to cut off his power. The atmosphere thickened with suspicion. Two men, once allies, now stalked each other in a silent duel. And in this deadly game, the foreign powers were not silent spectators. Britain still had its hand in Ugandan politics. Israel had forged close ties with Amin, using Uganda as a base to train soldiers and project influence in East Africa. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was whispering into Obote's ear, promising him weapons and support if he would turn Uganda towards socialism. Uganda had become a chessboard of the Cold War, and in the middle stood Idi Amin. Then came January 1971. Obote was abroad, attending a Commonwealth meeting in Singapore. Back home, Amin acted. Soldiers loyal to him moved swiftly through Kampala. Tanks rolled down the streets, machine guns pointed at key government buildings. The coup was sudden, brutal, and decisive. Obote's men were caught off guard. Within hours, the capital was in Amin's grip. The radio crackled with a voice that Ugandans would soon know all too well. The crowd erupted, not in fear, but in joy. People poured into the streets, dancing, cheering, banging drums. For them, Obote had become a symbol of corruption, tribal favoritism, and heavy-handed rule. Amin, the towering soldier, the man of the people, promised something different. He declared himself a humble servant, a simple soldier taking power not for himself, but for the people. The crowd believed him. Or perhaps they wanted to believe him. For the first weeks, Amin played the role of benevolent leader. He visited hospitals, shook hands with workers, appeared in markets eating local food. He freed political prisoners, promised democracy, and vowed to restore dignity. He even allowed Milton Obote's supporters to speak freely, at least at first. But beneath the surface, the clock was already ticking. The coup had been swift, but it had not been clean. Amin knew Obote still had allies, both in Uganda and abroad. He also knew that his own power rested on loyalty from the military, loyalty that could evaporate overnight. To secure his throne, Amin turned to the methods he had learned long ago in the colonial army: intimidation, violence, and fear. He began purging the army of those he did not trust, especially soldiers from tribes loyal to Obote. Executions became routine, disappearances multiplied. Within months, hundreds were dead. Soldiers, officials, intellectuals. Amin consolidated power with ruthless efficiency. And yet, to ordinary Ugandans, life in 1971 still carried a strange sense of hope. Amin spoke in simple, direct language. He laughed with market women. He promised to fight corruption, to rebuild Uganda's pride, to stand up against the arrogance of foreign powers. Unlike Obote, who was seen as distant and elitist, Amin looked like them, spoke like them, ate like them. But behind the laughter was a storm brewing. Amin was not just building a government, he was building a reign of terror. And those who underestimated him, whether friend or foe, would soon discover the cost of betrayal. By 1972, Idi Amin was firmly in control. The coup was over, the streets of Kampala belonged to him, and the barracks whispered his name with fear. But Amin was never satisfied with power alone. He wanted to be remembered, feared, and respected not just in Uganda, but across Africa and the world. It was in August of that year that Amin made the decision which would define his rule and etch his name into history: the expulsion of Uganda's Asian community. For decades, under British colonial rule, tens of thousands of Indians and Pakistanis had been brought into Uganda. They ran businesses, managed shops, controlled trade and industry. To many Ugandans, they represented wealth and privilege in a land where most lived in poverty. Amin saw an opportunity. He stood before cameras, his military uniform pressed, his beret tilted low, and announced his decree. All Asians had 90 days to leave Uganda. "This is our country." The world gasped. Diplomats condemned him. London threatened sanctions. Washington muttered about human rights. But on the streets of Kampala, Amin was celebrated. Crowds cheered, singing his name. To them, he had struck a blow against colonial privilege, against foreign exploitation. For once, Uganda belonged to Ugandans. Planes flew out of Entebbe airport, packed with entire families, leaving behind shops, factories, homes, and businesses. Amin redistributed the abandoned wealth to his allies, his soldiers, and his supporters. Some called it justice, others called it theft. The economy, once balanced on the backs of Asian entrepreneurs, began to wobble. Within years, mismanagement and corruption hollowed it out. But for Amin, the expulsion was not about economics. It was about power, symbolism, and defiance. And defiance became his trademark. He broke ties with Britain, mocking Queen Elizabeth as if she were a colonial ghost clinging to the past. He ridiculed Israel, turning instead to Libya's Muammar Gaddafi for support. He embraced the Soviet Union and the Palestinians, offering safe haven to their fighters. To the West, Amin had become unpredictable, dangerous, uncontrollable. To many Africans, he was a folk hero, a giant who stood up to empire. But beneath the charisma, the laughter, the theatrics, there was fear. Amin's paranoia deepened with every year. His cabinet ministers came and went, often vanishing into the night, never to be seen again. His intelligence service, the State Research Bureau, became a place of whispers and screams. Ordinary citizens learned never to speak his name in public, for walls had ears and mistakes had consequences. The rivers of Uganda told their own story. Fishermen whispered of corpses drifting downstream, their faces mutilated, their hands bound. Bodies washed up on the banks, silent warnings to anyone who dared question the regime. And yet, through it all, Amin maintained his larger-than-life image. He played the role of clown and king, one moment cracking jokes on television, the next sending shockwaves through the international community. He styled himself as conqueror of the British Empire, King of Scotland, lord of all the beasts of the earth and fishes of the sea. The West laughed at the absurdity. But in Uganda, the laughter was hollow. Everyone knew that behind the jokes lay bullets. Amin had become a paradox, both liberator and tyrant, hero and butcher. His charm disarmed crowds, but his violence silenced them. And as the years went on, his enemies multiplied, not just in Uganda, but beyond its borders. The stage was being set for a storm that would shake East Africa. By the mid-1970s, Idi Amin's image had grown into myth. To some, he was a fearless Pan-African lion roaring against the arrogance of empire. To others, he was a ruthless despot who fed on fear. But one truth cut through every story. Power had changed him, and paranoia was consuming him. Cabinet ministers who once stood at his side began disappearing. Generals who questioned him were found dead in shallow graves. Friends became traitors overnight, and traitors became corpses by morning. No one in Amin's circle ever felt safe, not even his wives, not even his closest allies. And still, he smiled, he joked, he danced in public rallies. To the cameras, he was charismatic, almost comedic. But behind closed doors, the air was heavy with suspicion and the sound of screams leaking through concrete prison walls. Then came 1976, the year the world truly saw the shadow that hung over Uganda. An Air France plane, hijacked by pro-Palestinian militants, was diverted to Entebbe airport, right in the heart of Amin's Uganda. The hijackers demanded the release of prisoners held in Israel and elsewhere. Amin, eager to show solidarity with the Palestinian cause, welcomed them, striding through the airport like a host greeting honored guests. Cameras captured him smiling beside the hijackers, promising them protection. But behind the scenes, Israel was planning something audacious. Under the cover of night, Israeli commandos stormed Entebbe in a raid so daring it seemed pulled from the pages of a thriller. Within 90 minutes, the hostages were freed, the hijackers killed, and Amin humiliated. The world cheered Israel's boldness, but Amin seethed with rage. To him, Entebbe was not just a defeat, it was a public wound. His enemies in the West had laughed at him, made him a fool on the global stage. And in Amin's Uganda, humiliation demanded blood. His reprisals were brutal. Hundreds of Ugandans accused of disloyalty were rounded up, tortured, executed. Even among his inner circle, suspicion ran wild. Fear became oxygen, and no one could breathe without it. But Amin's paranoia did not stop at his borders. He cast his eyes south, toward Tanzania. President Julius Nyerere, who had sheltered Milton Obote and spoken against Amin, was an old enemy. Amin accused Nyerere of plotting to overthrow him. The tension escalated until, in 1978, Amin made a decision that would prove fatal. Ugandan troops crossed the border into Tanzania, seizing the town of Kagera. It was an act of aggression, reckless and bold, the move of a man who believed he was untouchable. But Tanzania did not bow. Nyerere declared war. The Tanzanian army, disciplined and determined, marched north with the support of Ugandan exiles who wanted Amin gone. Village by village, town by town, they cut through Amin's forces, exposing the hollow shell of his once feared army. Soldiers who had once killed in his name now fled the battlefield. The myth of Amin's invincibility began to crack. By April 1979, Tanzanian tanks rolled into Kampala. The city fell with shocking speed. Crowds that once cheered Amin now poured into the streets to celebrate his downfall. The giant who had promised pride, power, and liberation was gone. Idi Amin fled into exile, first to Libya under Gaddafi's protection, and later to Saudi Arabia, where he would live out his days in silence, far from the country he once ruled with an iron fist. In Kampala, people whispered about the ghosts he left behind, the thousands who never returned home, the rivers that carried secrets, the fear that had lived in every shadow. But they also whispered about how he had stood up to the West, how he had dared to defy Britain, Israel, and America. Even in exile, Amin remained a paradox. To some, he was a butcher. To others, a folk hero who dared to challenge empire. To history, he was a mystery, one man who embodied both the hopes and the horrors of post-colonial Africa. And so, Idi Amin's Uganda collapsed in fire and silence. The man who once stood at the center of the world stage, who declared himself conqueror of Britain and lion of Africa, now slipped away quietly into exile. In Saudi Arabia, far from the roar of Kampala crowds, he lived a strangely ordinary life. No longer a general in boots, but a shadow in the desert. He prayed, he raised his children, he shopped in markets where few recognized the giant who once terrified a nation. But back in Uganda, the memory of Amin did not fade. It lingered like smoke after a fire. For some, he was the man who gave Uganda pride, who refused to bow to colonial masters, who demanded respect for Africa on the world stage. For others, he was a tyrant who ruled with fear, whose name became a warning whispered across villages. The truth, perhaps, lies somewhere in between. Because Amin's story is not just about one man. It is about the fragile line between liberation and tyranny, between heroism and horror. He rose from a barefoot soldier to the palace of power, carried by charisma, brutality, and the hunger of a nation searching for identity. But with every step upward, the shadows grew darker. To this day, historians still debate the real number of lives lost, the depth of his crimes, the motives behind his actions. Was he a monster born of violence, or a soldier swallowed by the very system he tried to control? What cannot be denied is this: Idi Amin's story is one of the most haunting chapters in Africa's post-colonial history. His name has become legend, echoing through documentaries, films, and whispers of survivors. And as the years pass, one chilling truth remains. When power is built on fear, it can rise like a storm. But sooner or later, like all storms, it must break.